Class is in session. What the hell is going on out there? Avery said aloud as several teachers and students were slamming their doors, one by one, and shutting off the lights. This is standard drill protocol for an active shooter lockdown. They have practiced for an event like this over and over the last few years. Why would we have a drill during the week of state testing? Avery asked. Mr. Miller looked confused by what was going on around them. He hadn't received a memo about any kind of drill or lockdown. Students, stay seated. Don't move, and please remain silent. I'm going to have a look at what is happening down the hall. Mr. Miller carefully opened the door. He was holding his breath as he stretched his upper body around the doorway in order to see what all the commotion was about. Along the hallway, only half of the lights were on. Mr. Miller could see two figures at the far end of the hall. One of them appeared to be dragging one leg behind them as if they were injured. He could hear faint screaming and yelling coming from the far end of the building. "What do you see, Mr. Miller?" Sophie shouted from the back of the room, with fear and desperation in her voice. Mr. Miller jumped out of his skin. He instructed his class to stay silent. However, the sudden outburst from his students startled him and resulted in his upper body hitting loudly against the door. The two figures down the hall started moving closer toward the classroom. Mr. Miller closed the door and then locked it. He shut off the lights and told his students to move to the far side of the room, away from the door and out of sight. His students did as instructed in a hurried fashion and prepared for the worst. Mr. Miller crouched down in front of the door, using his weight to help hold it in place. This was completely unnecessary considering he already locked the door and released the doorstop. His extra measure gave him peace of mind. Footsteps could be heard coming closer to the door. It sounded like someone stomping, running, and dragging their feet simultaneously. Whoever it was kept smacking their hands against each door on the way to Mr. Miller's classroom. Two shadowed figures appeared through the glass of the door. They pressed their faces against the window and proceeded to smack and bang against the door. More shouting could be heard coming from the main doors of the school. This was close to Mr. Miller's room. "Police! Back away from the door!" A male could be heard. "Down to the ground now!" A female voice commanded. Both of the uninvited guests moved quickly from Mr. Miller's door, and they proceeded towards the police officers. The police instructed them once again to lie down on the ground, but they did not comply. Mr. Miller stood up and peered through the window of the door and watched in horror as the police started to open fire on the two suspects. It sounded like a firing range in the middle of the hall. Mr. Miller watched one shot after another go in and out of their bodies as they continued to move in on the police officers. "Why aren't they stopping? How are they still alive?" Mr. Miller said aloud. The students who were huddled along the far wall of the classroom started to panic. "What's happening, Mr. Miller? Who's out there?" One of the students cried out. Mr. Miller backed away from the door and had to steady himself after what he just witnessed. The two invaders, who were being shot to pieces by the police, were still moving in on them. One of the strangers grabbed an officer and bit into his neck, ripped out his carotid artery, and with a single bite and clawed out his eye like a rabid animal. Mr. Miller had a look of absolute terror in his eyes. In the midst of all the commotion, the students in the classroom were panicked and screaming. "Students, stay where you are!" Mr. Miller commanded. He reached under his desk and pulled out a handgun. The students' level of panic increased. Mr. Miller removed a key from his pocket and used it to open the bottom drawer to his desk. He then grabbed a small box of bullets. With shaky hands, Mr. Miller loaded the clip and inserted that into his weapon. The screaming and the banging that was unfolding in the hall was getting louder and more intense. The students in the class were inconsolable. They were beyond horrified by what was happening. Mr. Miller's attention was pulled from the loading of the gun back to the door. There were now 4 people visible at the window, beating on the door and pushing the window with a bloodthirsty look in their cold eyes and foam oozing from their mouths. Mr. Miller finally loaded his firearm and was attempting to raise it against the intruders. The safety and well-being of his students was the only thing on his mind. He raised his weapon and moved forward without noticing that his swivel chair was directly in his path. His ankle rolled as he made contact with the chair. This caused him to tumble forward. Mr. Miller lost his grip and dropped his gun. The impact made after hitting the floor caused his weapon to discharge and fired a single shot directly through his chin and burst out through the back of his neck, severing his spine. His lifeless body dropped to the floor like a bag of flour in front of his entire class. All of the order within the classroom was now gone, and it wasn't coming back. Crying, screaming, and vomiting by many of the students echoed throughout the room. The threat from outside of the class broke through the glass and started to pour in through the doorway. The 2 police officers that were outside attempting to stop the intruders were now tattered and eviscerated shells of their former selves. They had death in their eyes and were hungry for more. The students were trapped in their class. There was nowhere for them to hide or to escape. A few of the students took chairs and began to break the windows in an attempt to flee. Several of the other students grabbed items near them as a means to defend themselves and fight for their lives. To their shock and horror, Mr. Miller suddenly sat up post-death and looked in their direction with death and hunger in his eyes. One of the students lunged towards the gun on the floor, intending to use it to save his classmates. He got a little too close to Mr. Miller, who was still sitting up on the floor. The student was grabbed by their teacher and pulled down to his level, where Mr. Miller bit into his face. He removed the student's nose and right cheek with the gnashing of his teeth, peeling it away like a huge piece of beef jerky. The remaining students climbed through the windows to evacuate, regardless of being on the second floor. Mr. Miller and the 4 other flesh eaters moved in on the barely conscious student and feasted on what remained. What started out as a normal day for the students of CHS was now a living nightmare.